Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Gupta and we are talking about threads of visual exploration, textiles and allied practices. So we have already spoken about some of the basic parameters of this course, and we have also looked into some of the ideas, for example, why textile is important in terms of understanding the visual culture and so on. And then we have also focused on this one issue, that is why we are looking especially into handmade textiles. After understanding these aspects, I guess right now it will be important for us to sort of get into the ideas about what all different kind of materials are used in making textiles, and then why we have to pay attention to the specificity of the material processes and everything else. Now in India we do find, or like as I have already mentioned in the earlier lecture, that when I say India, we are already talking about the Indian subcontinent and not the Indian nation state that was formed after 1947. So in India we find from the for a long period of time that many kind of fibers are used. As I have already mentioned, that there are cellulose fibers, that is cotton, linen, some kind of like the one that comes from flax, and then hemp, nettle and so on. And then we also have, of course, we also have jute and other things, but those are not extensively used for making textiles. Now the other kind of the animal based protein fibers that we have also spoken about, those will be wool and silk and so on. So what we'll try to do today, we'll look into the this cotton and try to understand that what are the kind of criteria for making cotton, how it impacted the material lives and the livelihood, as well as like the community lives and everything in the Indian subcontinent. So as we see on the slide, that there is this one tokri or a basket, and then it is overflowing with cotton. So cotton, that is something that we see here, it is something that comes from the seed pod. So cotton is something that is understood as cash crop, which is harvested alongside, which has been harvested alongside many other food crops. So it is not something that is exclusively just harvested in a land where no other food crop or anything else cannot be harvested. However, that kind of harvesting we have seen in the indigenous agricultural setup. However, after industrialization, we do see that there are dedicated places where cotton farming is encouraged, and then today we do see a lot of the cotton seeds which are not really the desi or the indigenous qualities of cotton. In the historic times, we do have a lot of varieties of cotton. Even today, if we try to understand cotton as also we see it on screen, it looks like cloud, it looks like white cloud. But the thing is, if we get into the depth of this fiber, then we'll also see that it is not something that is homogeneous all across the Indian subcontinent, that there are different kinds of cotton. There are cottons which has much shorter fiber, then there are cotton which will have like much longer fiber, and both kind of cotton would be used for different kind of purposes. Now apart from that, what we also find that the cotton fabric fragments were also found from some of the Indus Valley sites like in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and then there are also clear signs of how cotton textiles, those were woven in the Indian subcontinent, were traded to other places in the Middle East and so on, in Mesopotamia and Egypt and so on. So that also gives us a sense about that how for the, at least for the last 3 millennia or so, people in the Indian subcontinent know about making or harvesting cotton and making use of it for making textiles and so on. So if this is one of the things we find, that we also see that there are different kind of processes in which, like from the seed pod, cotton is extracted. So in the seed pod of the cotton, after the cotton this reaches its mature phase, then we find in the seed pod there are seeds, and then like around the seed there is this this cloud like fiber formation that we have on screen there. And the thing is that once that is harvested, we do not really see it the same way that is there on screen. So it needs to go through a longer process for sort of like it's separation from the seeds and the other kind of dust particle and then impurities, and then we find that how it sort of reaches to this point where we can see only this cloud like formation and nothing else. So for example, we have different kinds of processes involved in cleaning these seeds, cleaning this the fiber. So in the seed pod, when we have the seed and around that the layers of this cotton, that is called lint. So lint is something that is then sort of separated from the seeds, and through the process of cleaning and ginning, and after ginning we find that only the lint is there, and then like the seeds and the impurities, dust and everything else is separated from this lint or like the cotton fiber. Now once this lint is there, we find that there are processes in which that is spun into yarn. So for spinning we have different kind of processes, and in one of them we'll find in which a form like a spindle is used. So something that we can see in the left side of the screen, this image in which there is a very simple formation in which there is a stick like form, and in the stick like form we also have something circular like a disc on the bottom of it, right? So in this one what happens, once you can keep the once you can keep this stick like form on the horizontal plane, and then what happens, it needs to be moved, and then when one end of the fiber is sort of tied this stick, and then once you spin it, and then the fibers sort of connect to the other parts of this blob of the lint, and then slowly the fibers get extracted, and then through this process of twisting and turning, then the tension between this fiber production, how this yarn is being produced, and then the entire lint, and that is how this slight tension that needs to be there for extracting or pulling the fiber out of the lint is something that is done by this spindle. And here in this image we can also see that there is this one simple spindle, and then here is also one where we can see that how this yarn is something that is extracted out of this thread, right, and which also leads to this blob of the cotton. So this is how cotton fiber is produced, and this is one of the simplest mean of making cotton fiber, cotton yarn. But there are also some of the other devices or tools we can find, and then of course we also have the spindle and a charkha. So those ones we also find them to be there, which are also much useful for extracting this cotton yarn out of the lint. Now, so here in the right side of this image, there is this one image from around 19th century, and where we find that there is an image of two men sitting there, and one person is clearly using a spindle, which we see here. And then how this spindle is held vertically on the horizontal plane, and then this man also holds a bit of cotton fiber, and through the tension of it, by holding this fiber in two hands, and then slowly sort of extracting the fibers out of it, and then sort of twisting it on this spindle, that is how the entire this yarn production takes place. It is one of the simplest mean of yarn production, as I have already mentioned. And then we find that once these yarns are produced, then there are many different ways in which these yarns are these yarns are colored. Sometimes these yarns would be dyed, or sometimes we can also find them to be undyed, and it all depends on how it is meant to be used. So all those different kind of things, we definitely find them to be there. Now about the making of the yarn, then what is this difference between, we can understand that the hand spinning, and if the spinning is done by in a factory setup. Now what happens in the hand spinning, as we can see that it's a very delicate process in which a person would be holding the cotton lint, and in one hand perhaps like somewhere connected to the spindle, and then like slowly pulling the thread, but also like applying the required tension in it, so that like the thread pulling is seamless. So through this process what we find that the twisting of the fibers, for which sort of like binds into the thread. So for example, if we think about twisting in this way, so this is how like how the fiber formations would be done. And so if this is one of the ways in which like we find the twisted fibers that sort of like appears in the hand spinning process, in the factory setup, if it is extracted by in the mechanized production, we find that the twisting is much more rigorous, and that is usually done for much more stability. However, what happens for that is that the fibers might become much more stiffer compared to the ones which are done in hand spinning, because in hand spinning we are not really twisting the fiber too much, but it kind of like twisting to the extent that it sort of like stays together as a fiber, as a yarn. So for that reason, what happens, at least what textile activist and scholar Archana Shah also argues, that for that reason we find that the hand spun fabric or like the hand spun yarn would have much more softer or like suppler quality compared to the ones which are which are like extracted through a mechanized process. Now the other thing also that what Archana Shah proposes, that with this what happens is that with the regular use of hand spun fabric, then the twisted fibers in the hand spun yarn, that also slowly unfolds little bit. When I say unfolding, I do not mean that is disintegrates completely, but slightly unfolds. And for this unfolding, what happens, it also makes room for more kind of like supple or like sort of much more in an elastic quality it sort of develops, and for that reason it also allows more air into the body and so on, and which also leads to like comfort of the wearer. So those kind of aspects we definitely find them to be ingrained in the process of spinning. So even though when we look at textiles, we do not think about whether the textiles are hand spun or not, like for example whatever we see around us, but the thing is that if we pay this close attention to these things and then the fiber formation and everything else, then we find that even in the process in which yarn is produced, that can make a huge deal of difference in terms of how this textile would fit in the wearer's body and what kind of comfort or discomfort it might provide to the wearer. So these are some of the aspects we can find, that how the making of it, the production process of it, and step-by-step understanding of the entire this process can lead us to a much better and critical appreciation of textiles. Now with this, we cannot really deny the another part of the textiles, or especially the cotton textiles, and that would be something that would have something to do with complicated history of colonialism. In the 17th century and later on, we find that with the arrival of the Western European traders, there was a huge demand for initially the cotton textiles. Those are made in India, and of course that we find that India has exported, or like the traders in India has have exported cotton textiles of various kinds for at least for the last 3 millennia, as I have already mentioned, that the textiles which are produced in the Indus Valley sites in Harappa, Mohenjo-daro and places like that, those were traded to Middle East and so on, and that kind of trade continued with the Roman Empire, part of Southeast Asia, part of Eastern Asia and Middle East and so on. Now with the arrival of the Western Europeans in the Indian subcontinent, what we find that there was a different kind of trade relations that started shaping up, and through this trade relation there was more kind of stress or more kind of interest towards like procuring the raw materials such as cotton and all, and then sending it back to Western Europe for making textiles in a mechanized setup, and then sending them back to these colonized countries for making larger profit, and which also like provided a large amount of resources for the colonial governments. So this kind of issues we find that even though textile is something we usually consider to be seemingly harmless, but it also sort of like folds into this a larger history of inequality, and also at the same time that how discrimination, also like the colonial rule and everything, that all started or like perhaps strengthened with time, with the use of textile, with the exploitation of the makers and so on. So that part of the history of textiles is also something we find that to be integrally connected to making and appreciation of cotton. Now, if we see that, this is one of the aspects of the cotton textile production, that how cotton was also a very important, or perhaps like one of the crucial material which was responsible for the colonial rule. Then we also find that the same material was also used for the anti-colonial resistance, at least in the 20th century. So during 1905, during the partition of Bengal, we find that there were some of the early traces of the nationalists. They claimed that there was a need for making hand-spun, hand-woven fabric in the locally, and not really prioritizing this fancy cotton, or like different kinds of fabrics which were which were sent from Manchester and other parts of Western Europe. So it definitely had this the nationalist sentiment attached to it, but then we find that to be like much more rigorously put forward by Mahatma Gandhi, or Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, in around 1920s, when he sort of established the Khadi movement. And the Khadi movement, with that we find that his interest was very much about some of the basic needs of the people in the Indian subcontinent. That can be about salt, that can be about cotton fabric, which is extensively used by people from all class and caste. So if that is something we find that how Gandhi looked at it from the perspective of a mean of unifying all the people in the Indian subcontinent, then we can see that how this same material we see here can be used in both different ways, that either for the colonial rule, or establishing the colonial rule, or sort of like continuing this exploitation, but at the same time the same material we can find that to be utilized by Gandhi as an anti-colonial tool, and which was used against the British for the demand of self-sustainment. So these are the different ways in which we find that how the cotton had been like very significant part of the history of the Indian subcontinent, and the political history, material history, and of course like the art history. Now with that, what kind of like cotton fabric, if we think about it, that what kind of cotton fabric that perhaps Gandhiji, or during the Swadeshi movement, what kind of cotton fabric were prioritized. So this is one of the cotton fabric that we have on screen in the right side. So even though this is not from the time period of early 20th century, and this is actually from early 21st century, but it is made in the same process of doing hand spinning and hand weaving. And in hand spinning, what happens, we also find that since it is sort of extracted by human hand, then there are also much chances of making the thread or the thread being slightly irregular in its linear density. So those kind of characteristics we definitely find that to be very much there in the hand spun yarn. And then this hand spun yarn then are dyed with natural dyes, the ones we see here on screen, and then like the dyed yarn and the undyed yarn, and then like they're set as the warp in which and then like I mean and then the white yarn is again used for making the weft of this fabric, and that is how this entire fabric is woven. So these are some of the examples of what we find, that what kind of fabric we are talking about. And then even though there are certain things about the technicalities about hand spinning, hand dyeing, or hand weaving, we see that there are also there are underlying significances of all of these processes, that this is not something that is just about celebrating the handmade, but it was about like denying the mechanized mean of production, which was not really doing any good for the people in the Indian subcontinent, and also about self-sustainment, that if we are thinking in terms of like production in many of the places in India, then different kind of technologies might not be available to many of the rural sectors. And if that was true some 75 years back, we still find that to be true to a large extent even today. So this kind of factors, we find that, I mean, if someone is much more reliant on particular kind of technologies for making textiles, then there are like, I mean, considerable amount of push towards going for the mechanized mean of production, and only in particular sites, but it cannot be distributed everywhere. It can also be like, I mean, it might also have the danger of losing out its diversity which has been inherent in them. So those are the kinds of things we find, that even in the smaller means of production, if hand spinning, hand weaving, and dyeing with the locally available resources and so on, those things can be done, then that has a different kind of significance in terms of practicing this local knowledge. Also at the same time, how the sustainability and then self-sufficiency, these things can be promoted even to the grassroots level. Now, when we talk about the cotton fabric, and something that we have been talking about it, that how Gandhiji had proposed, and then like, I mean, of course he had spearheaded the Khadi movement in the 1920s, and the effect of it we still have in our country today. So those aspects we will be touching upon in the later modules. However, what I wanted to show it here is that cotton is again something that is tremendously diverse in its nature, and based on the geographical location where cotton is produced, we find that many different kinds of variety of the fiber and the yarn, those are there. So for example, in the left side of the screen we have a coarse cotton gamcha, or a towel, or a shoulder cloth, whatever we call it, is there. And in this one we can see that, I mean, how the coarse nature of the cotton fabric is reflected on the slight bent of it, and how this you know, one can almost see the fiber, I mean, one can almost see, like, I mean, the yarn, those are passing through here, like, I mean, how the white yarn, and then like, I mean, when it is intersecting with the red yarn, one can almost see the almost like a pixelated formation that one can see it there. So that kind of thing we can see that, I mean, this is for the coarse cotton, which made this kind of like visibility possible. So when we are also looking at cotton fabric, no matter where it is, then we need to keep in mind that what kind of yarn that is been used there. Now, one of the things that we find that that is usually sort of like, I mean, sort of employed for understanding the coarseness or thinness of the cotton yarn is something that is called the thread count. And thread count is something that is usually the linear density of the yarn. So it's usually that 840 yards of 840 yards of the length of the fiber is something that needs to that weighs around 1 pound, and we are still talking about, like, I mean, pound and yard and everything else, right? So this 840 yards of the length of the fiber, that sort of weighs around 1 pound. If we say that 30 count, that means like 30 such fibers would be weighing around 1 pound. Now the 30 count, that means, like, I mean, the fibers would be much more thicker in density, and they are much more coarse So like 30 fiber can actually 30 yarn can actually weigh around like 1 pound. So that is the sort of like the measurement. Now what happens that in terms of like cotton production, we find that 30 count, if that is used for the cotton that is used on daily basis, and mostly in many different parts of the Indian subcontinent, we find that the cotton fabric which is utilized by people who would be working in the fields, or like working as laborers and so on. Coarse cotton fabric is something that is much more sort of easily available to people. But that said, that we also find that there are different kinds of cotton, right? So in one of the varieties we will find that is muslin, which was extracted and which was produced in parts of eastern India, now that is in Bangladesh mostly, and part of West Bengal, and in which we find in this very damp, moist climate that particular kind of cotton production, also like a particular kind of spinning, enabled the count go up to 500, and some claim that there were also like there was also like this kind of production where the thread count might go up to 1000. So that means we are talking about cotton yarn which is super fine, which is almost like invisible, and that is the reason muslin is something that is called as woven air. Now in the right side of the screen we have a muslin cloth woven recently in Bangladesh, and the thread count here almost goes up to 350 or so. And one of the characters of this muslin cloth that had been there for centuries, that an entire fabric, when it is folded, it can be passed through a ring, and that is what we find there in the image as well, that how this fabric can be like folded, and then like once it is twisted, it can actually sort of pass through a ring. So we are talking about fabric which is almost like air, and that's the reason like we can see this kind of flexibility of the fabric that is enabled. And if we compare it to the one that we have on the left side of the screen, the coarse cotton textile cannot have this kind of character that we have for muslin. Here is another example that we find here, that how when we are looking into the coarse cotton, the fine cotton, then what kind of difference we might actually find there. So in the right side of the screen we have this another representation of this recently woven muslin in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and in this one we can see that how the sheer quality, the diaphanous quality of the fabric is sort of projected, and by putting a hand in the inner layer of this fabric, and one can see that how this diaphanous quality of this woven fabric is almost that one can see all the layers which is underneath. So those kind of characteristics we find that to be there in the muslin cloth, and that is something we will also find that how that comes back to the paintings or like the different kind of visual representations we see. So we'll come to the visual representation in the next lecture. Thank you.